And we're live.
Woo.
Let's see now if it actually tweeted out the thing so that I can retweet it.
I see
It's
us.
on the JS Jabber thing. Yes, I see us as well. So
Cool.
let's let's retweet it. I'll actually quote tweet it.
I'm currently looking up orange backgrounds to maximize contrast lighting of my face
Yeah,
versus
I'm
my wall.
I'm trying to properly write squiggle conf. Do you have like an X handle for it?
We do. We're on all the things X, Blue Sky, Mastodon, and it's all SquiggleConf. Somehow no one had previously taken that name, which is shocking and horrifying to us.
So let me. Okay, so I retweeted it as well. Okay, here we go.
Thanks. Appreciate
So,
it.
okay, let me officially go live. Okay, you ready? We can start.
Let's do this.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. Today, I'm flying solo, both as host and panelist. Maybe some of our other hosts will join us later on. We will see. Our guest today is Josh Goldberg. Hi, Josh.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
You do know that when you wave, people who listen to our podcast don't actually hear anything.
I was hoping the good vibes would, emanate from the podcast, but that's a good point.
Yeah, it reminds me that when my kids were really young and we would drive and they would be sitting in the back and I would ask them something while I'm driving and they would nod their heads.
Yeah.
Uh, so, yeah. Anyway, uh, so welcome back to our show. It's been a while. We've had you here before. We're actually going to be talking about similar topics to what we've spoken about in the past, but a lot of, I guess, has happened since then. So hopefully we can catch up. The topics are going to be TSESlint, which is a project you've been working on for a while now, and also your new conference. What's it called? SquiggleConf?
SquiggleConf, yes. Named after the things that give you squigglies in your editor.
Cool, cool, cool. So, what do we want to start with?
Well, I'm a sucker for going in order. Typescript-eslint, TSESlint.
Yeah, okay, but you know what? Before then, since it has been a while, can you also, provide a quick introduction about who you are, what you do, why it's exciting to have you on?
With pleasure. Hi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm a full time independent open source maintainer. That means that instead of working for one specific company, I'm independent. I work on my own and I work on open source projects that benefit the ecosystem. For me specifically, the main ones I work on are TypeScript-eslint, which is the tooling that lets you run standard JavaScript tools like ESLint and Prettier on TypeScript code, as well as ESLint itself on the committer team, and Mocha. So I'm just kind of generally happy to float around GitHub and try to make things better for everyone.
As I recall, we've spoken about it in the past, but I think it is worth bringing it up again. Is it really possible to make a living off of open source, especially given that it's free?
Yeah, free as in it's a hard question. It is theoretically possible. Some projects are better suited for it than others. The ones I tend to work on tend to be not very well suited. But I do make what is defined as a livable wage in my area, which is better than the achievement last year, which was minimum wage. But it's not anywhere near it was as it was in a full time salaried position for me. So there's a good chance that'll eventually go back once I've made the impact I wanted to in open source.
So you're what, living off some of your savings? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think I'm net negative right now, in large part because my fantastic wife, my spouse, has a real job and health insurance, which is very important in the United States, as some may know. But I do get income. I have community sponsorships on a lot of the projects that I'm on. That I get a share for many of them. I've got book revenue from my Learning TypeScript book. Go buy it today. And generally, there are some people who sponsor me individually on GitHub sponsors. So I'm not hemorrhaging money. I'm just not making a lot of money.
And if people who are listening to us do want to contribute to your efforts, what's the best way to go about it?
Well, first of all, they should feel very good about themselves because that's very kind and noble of them. Thank you. If they want to support me specifically in the stuff that I'm specifically doing, github.com/sponsors/ Joshua K. Goldberg, or if you just Google me or look me up, my name's on my site. For any of the projects I work on, if that's particularly exciting to you, especially typescript-eslint, they all have open collectives that you can sponsor. So there's definitely a way for you to give me money if you want to.
And you mentioned your book on TypeScript. When did that come out?
It's been a couple of years now. I believe 2022, mid late summer. It's through O'Reilly, Learning TypeScript, and it has this beautiful, yellow and colored bird on the cover.
And given the name Learning TypeScript, I gather that it's primarily for people who are not familiar with it and want to get into it, like newbies, effectively.
Exactly, yeah. The general flow of the book is that you can start with roughly intermediate JavaScript knowledge. You should know how variables and closures and stuff like that work. You don't need to be super fancy advanced JavaScript expert. You don't need to know, I don't know, symbols and stuff like that. But you don't need any prior knowledge or experience with types through whatever C Sharp, C++, Java, Rust. None of that is necessary. If you already know it, great. TypeScript works a little differently, so you'd still learn stuff. But you can come in with just JavaScript and emerge a relatively competent TypeScript developer.
That brings up an interesting point. So, a few weeks back, we recorded an episode with people talking about lead code tests that so many companies are using these days when filtering out applicants. And I wasn't actually able to participate on it, so I'm just listening to the recording like everybody else. And they brought up one of the things that they discussed was about which programming languages are supported by that platform. Turns out that many are. You can practically choose any language you want. And both JavaScript and TypeScript are supported as languages apparently that you can use for, solving the lead code challenge. Uh, and I was thinking about it, and if I were to do it today, I would, there's a good chance that I would choose to use JavaScript, but I'm like wondering why anybody would use TypeScript as opposed to JavaScript when solving a lead code challenge. What do you think about that?
It's a good question. I don't know what I'd use, honestly. I haven't done leak code in a while. I think it's a fun little hobby that one can do, like a niche little area of programming. And I detest how associated it's become with job interviews. That's just not a core competency that we use day to day as much as, debugging or pairing. But I digress. I don't know. It's the rule that I normally go through is the rule of three. If I'm using more than 3 files or working with 3 or more people in a project, I'll switch from JavaScript to TypeScript. Leak code doesn't really satisfy that rule. So the overhead of TypeScript needing to or trying to get you to define types for things or being aggressive when you haven't defined enough types oftentimes isn't worth it. It can be useful though if you have experience and if you feel comfortable writing out types or just using any in a lot of places. So yeah, I can see the motivation for it, but I wouldn't go for it myself.
Yeah, me too. I'm thinking that probably the sweet spot for dynamic languages is rapid prototyping.
Yeah.
And with lead code, that's essentially what you're doing. you're trying to hammer out a working solution as quickly as possible. Usually you're constrained in time. Writing anything that at the end of the day doesn't actually get translated into executable code seems like a waste of time in that context. So yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, but in any event, it's nice of them to support it as an option. You know,
Yeah.
Interesting. I once, by the way, commented that my ideal development environment would be me writing JavaScript and everybody else writing TypeScript. That way, I don't have to mess around with types, but everything that I do is supported by types, and I get all the completion. And the only problem with that is that everybody else includes me from about a week
Yep.
ago. So,
Yeah.
I might be smiling now, but I'll be sad in a week if I write
Yeah.
my stuff in JavaScript.
Yeah. I think the really baller move for interviews is to use the TypeScript type system instead of the runtime. That's really where we shine. Yeah.
Yeah, using the type system itself as a programming language. Uh, yeah, I know some people who do that, who dabble in that sort of thing. I used to do that sort of crazy stuff when I back in the day with C++ because essentially any language which supports sufficiently sophisticated generics can
Yeah.
be used as its own, quote unquote types programming language because you get conditional. You effectively can implement conditionals and loops via recursion. So yeah, it's an interesting approach, but mm, yeah, mostly a game and not something you want to do anywhere near production code.
Yeah.
By the way, one more interesting point about this whole thing about TypeScript and when it's appropriate. I have to confess that when TypeScript initially came out, my initial attitude was kind of negative because all the original demos were around classes and enums and stuff like that. And it might not be surprising given that it was created by the same Microsoft people that gave us C sharp. And back at the time they kind of, I guess, didn't really know any better. But my feeling initially with looking at the original sample uh, TypeScript code that they were, showcasing was that this is kind of a poor man's Java. And since I much prefer JavaScript to Java, that feeling that TypeScript was kind of pulling me back into the Java realm was something that, really rubbed me the wrong way. And I kind of like totally flipped on that. I did like a 180 on that when I realized that you can do, function JavaScript functional style programming and get all the benefits of types with TypeScript. And now that TypeScript has come such a long way and you got so much inference going on and the cool things with generics and stuff like that, you can achieve very cool type safety and without having to use classes and interfaces at all in your code. So yeah, so that's my confession about TypeScript. Does it kind of match your own feelings about the topic?
It does, yeah. Um, I think you really hit the nail on the head on the two big advancements in marketing that TypeScript had. One is that at the beginning they were really appealing to people on the in large part on the premise of you can use these features you've been missing, which included both classes and the type system. Nowadays, the marketing doesn't really mention classes, both because that's a core part of the language now, over a decade later, and because we accidentally ended up with the misconception in the community that TypeScript is more for class oriented rather than say functional approaches, which is now that you've hit the nail on the second point that TypeScript actually supports functional programming and really non-class but still type safe approach as well. That I would even say that that's a better way of using TypeScript in many cases. So I think it's just really cool to see how marketing evolves over time as people learn better how to use and how to market a tool like TypeScript, for example.
But is it just marketing, or is it also how TypeScript itself has technically evolved?
It's a good question. Um, I would love to hear you interview every 2 to 4 years at the very rarest, or at least common, core folks from the TypeScript team to see how their answers to this evolve over time. I'm sure it'd be fascinating. I think that if you look back at how TypeScript discussions, which are many which are public, like their meeting notes and their issue responses have been on GitHub, it's been pretty consistent that they don't try to specifically go for, say, classes and OOP. It's just that that was one of the big things they had to implement early on for standardization, for marketing, for. But I don't say marketing a derogatory term. I just mean these are the things that people needed from TypeScript. But they've in virtually every discussion tried to pull the focus back from specific things like supporting I don't know injectable classes or supporting functional style insert paradigm here, and really try to think what are the common community needs for type safety, what are the ways of bending or describing or manipulating types that folks are commonly using across many different teams, organizations, paradigms, and how can we build that in an agnostic way in the type system such that anyone benefits, not just specifically, say, classes.
I'm totally with you on that. I think that first of all, I have to say that in a lot of ways, the TypeScript people like have a super hard job. I compare it to herding cats.
Yeah.
Basically, you take the poster child for dynamic languages, a language that is dynamic but also has dynamic objects. Like everything in JavaScript is dynamic, is it's dynamic as you can get, and then try to enforce a static type system on top of that. And my feeling is that, especially in recent years, and to be fair and honest, I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable about the history and evolution of TypeScript to tell you, which features came first and which features came in later, and what happened sooner or later. I'm more knowledgeable of JavaScript than TypeScript in this regard. But um, what I see now is that in the past I had this kind of feeling that TypeScript is trying to force me to do things certain ways. That sometimes I had certain paradigms that I implemented in JavaScript in ways that I really liked, and I couldn't get them to work properly with TypeScript. And now I can. Now it's difficult for me to say whether it's because TypeScript has evolved and improved, or because my knowledge of TypeScript has evolved and improved. Might be, probably it's both. But the feeling is that you can now be much more expressive in what you can achieve with TypeScript, and you don't necessarily have to forego, you know, mainstream JavaScript paradigms just to get the benefits of TypeScript.
Yeah, agreed. I think included in that second point of you're more happy with TypeScript or more TypeScripty yourself. Part of that includes understanding intuitively what are the types of flows or types that TypeScript is easily able to represent. There are a lot of complex things you can represent with TypeScript with a lot of glue and tomfoolery, but the stuff that's really clean and beautiful and succinct, people tend to gravitate towards the more they write TypeScript, which I think is a really good thing because TypeScript types are how we generally represent JavaScript concepts and the way our data flows in code. So if something is difficult to represent in TypeScript, there's a very good chance that it's based on something that's not easy to explain to others or easy to represent in code. So I think there's this
Yeah.
kind of beautiful synergy there.
By the way, Jay Larkey comments that, quote, I think JS got better, so they had to do less stuff on top of JS
Yeah.
nowadays. I agree, but it's not doesn't necessarily mean that the TypeScript people have less work, because you need to support in the type system all this new JS stuff as well, especially since a lot of the TypeScript sophistication comes from the ever growing ability to statically analyze the code and figure out stuff like type narrowing based on logic that you actually see in the code. So if you do like an if in the code and bail out, like short circuit in some condition, then it probably also narrows the types moving forward, because you've kind of ejected out that those aspects of the types that are no longer relevant. By the way, speaking of all that, and taking us finally to take it to TSES-lint, it brings up an interesting point. Given all this sophistication and power in TypeScript itself, why do we actually need a linter for TypeScript? Isn't TypeScript itself enough in that regard?
Oh, I love it. There's so many good reasons why one would want a linter, and a few bad reasons. Just for my emotional sake, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with the bad. A lot of folks,
Go for it.
yes, a lot of folks used to use ESLint for a few things that, among others, that we no longer recommend in the linting world. Formatting or silly stylistic rules would be the big ones. Um, ESLint is a linter, which means it allows you to provide a bunch of individual rules, which are little pieces of code that yell at you if your code is not working the way it should or it doesn't look the way it should. And then that's separate from a formatter, which reformats your code, or a type checker, which looks at all the types in your code. So formatter, linter, type checker. A linter is structurally not very good at formatting. So if you were using ESLint for formatting, there are a lot of gaps. Like there are a lot of little edge cases that aren't really covered by any one rule, or it's hard to write that type of logic in a lint rule. It's much easier to do a big formatter sweep like with Prettier. So there are
And
projects that let you
formatting
format.
is about, just to make it clear to our audience,
Sorry.
it's about stuff like indentation, line length, line
Yeah.
breaks, stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Semicolons, white space type. Yeah. So there is a project, really good one called ESLint Stylistic for enforcing formatting with ESLint, but it's not part of core anymore. And a lot of people associated, oh, it's yelling at me about semicolons with linters, and then just stopped using linters altogether, which
Hmm.
is not the right conclusion. But there are a lot of really good things you can do with them. Generally speaking, linters can apply logic in cases where it might be type safe. For example, you might be creating a promise, which is type safe, but then you do something dangerous with it that's still type safe, such as not handling the rejection case of that promise. Like if you forget to await it and then you console log it. That's all type safe, but that's probably not what you wanted to do, which means you still want a tool separate from your type checker to let you know about these probable mishaps.
So, can you give a couple of examples of some of the rules that TSCS-Lint enforces? I know we discussed those in the previous time that we had you on the show, but still, I think it's still worth reviewing. Also, if you've got some new ones since then.
Oh, yeah. Um, the classic example that we always jump to is promises, like the you forgot to await type stuff, because that's a huge source of bugs, and we get a lot of reports from people that that's the key thing they need from us. Having a function that returns a promise, declaring that in your code, and then passing it to something that doesn't know the function it's calling that you're passing returns a promise. So then the async logic just floats off in the distance somewhere. That type of weird edge case that is still type safe but not right. Another one would be for in array is the rule, or no for in array, where there are two common ways of looping over an object in JavaScript. There's for in and for of. For in loops over the keys, for of loops over the values of an iterable. So if you use for in on an array, you'll get the stringified array keys, which is technically type safe. That's technically something some people might want to do. But in practice, why the heck would you ever want to do that? That's a lint rule yelling at you area of concern.
Yeah, for-in is one of those things that's in the language, it's legal. It doesn't do what you probably expect, and therefore you should probably not use it. Or put another way, if you're Kyle Simpson, then you probably have a very good reason to use it, but
Yeah.
otherwise you probably don't.
Yeah. I think you touch on such an interesting point that there are a lot of people who are very, very deeply experienced, knowledgeable, influential JavaScript developers who do not see the value of linting, or at least do not themselves experience it, because they instinctively, they always handle their promises. They know what they're doing. They don't write for in on an array. They write for of. But a lot of the value of the linter is for people who don't have, 20 years of writing JavaScript and then TypeScript. People who are still new and learning.
To be fair, There's a certain point in it. I'd say not seeing the value in linting is a bit harsh. I would
Mm.
say rather that they would disable certain rules that you'd probably want to keep enabled for most people. Um, and but the reality is that usually, like, you don't work alone, and you want to conform to the rest of the code base. So the example that I like to give, and I don't know if there's a linting or formatting rule for that, is that whole debate about whether when you're creating functions, named functions, whether you should use the function keyword or whether you should do something like a const name equals an array.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people using now obviously they're not identical. There are certain differences, and we can, touch on those, but but it to a great extent it's just an issue of personal preference. My personal preference is the function keyword, and I can explain why that is. But at the end of the day, is what I do is I conform with the project code base. Like if the project uses does prefers arrow named arrow functions, I will use named arrow functions, because if you start, deviating in your own code, you're creating an unwanted and unnecessary cognitive overhead, because people will look at that piece of code later and say, hey, this code looks different than the rest. Why is that? Is it doing something different? And they have to start thinking about it. They don't trust their instincts around it anymore, and that's a bad thing. So consistency above everything else, and that's another big benefit of linting, both stylistic linting and semantic linting,
Strong
that it
agree.
that it generates consistency.
Yeah. That's something a formatter can't do because, as you said, sometimes there is a subtle logical difference between different keywords or different types. And that's something a type checker won't do because, well, it's all type safe. That's exactly what one of the big use cases for linter is.
Um, so, keeping on. So you said that some of the main benefit of linting is to highlight things that are correct, like using for in, or not putting a weight on your promises, or maybe not putting a catch on somewhere. So those are all things that are totally valid in terms of the code, but are probably something that things that, you know, are not right. Let's put it this way. You probably don't want to do. So it's a warning rather than an error would be the way that I would phrase it. And then you want uh and that's where the linter kind of steps in. Is that the way that you would phrase it as well?
Yeah. It's a warning that in most cases you generally still want to fail to build on. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
There's one more really good use case that gets forgotten a lot. You can write custom lint rules. That's one of the big things that ESLint became successful from being able to support early on. If you're on a team that, let's say, moving from one way of calling an API to another, you can write a lint rule enforcing, that people use the new way, not the old way. And you can even write a fixer, like an auto fixer in your lint rule, to migrate code from the old way to the new way as a form of a code mod. And having been on a web platform team, I can tell you that's incredibly helpful and useful.
Mm, that is nice. So what is new in TSES Lint? I gather that a new version is coming out, came out, about to come out.
Came out. TypeScript ESLint V8. Thank you for bringing it up. Uh, we uh,
V8 is a
we
special name.
I know we've had a few people get confused about how it's not the tomato juice and it's not the engine underlying, Chromium and JavaScript, but it's our newest major version. It has a lot of good things in it. Just the high level overview is every major version we improve and iterate on the list of recommended rule sets, our little shareable configs. This one has ESLint v9 support, which was unfortunately kind of delayed on our end. And it has this new thing called the project service, which makes typed rules the most powerful lint rules we offer. A lot more, we hope, easy, straightforward, understandable to configure. So we're really excited about it.
So, what's the thing that you're most excited about in the context of the new version?
The project service. A lot of the lint rules that we just talked about and that are elsewhere mentioned about being awesome and powerful need type information. For example, we said no for in array. Well, how do you know what is an array? Or, properly calling a function that's async and makes a promise. How do you know the function is async or returns a promise in general? You have to use a type checker for that, because what if you import it from a file or some other npm package or something? And in order to do that, we have to then call into the TypeScript APIs. And there are not that many projects that do that. So this is still kind of a new and exploratory area in the realm of JavaScript, TypeScript tooling. So the project service is this term for this new set of APIs that we're using from TypeScript that align type checking to behave more like what you use in your editor, which means it's a little easier to set up. We can infer more stuff. And it shouldn't have
Hmm.
these weird differences where ESLint understands something differently than what you see in VS Code.
Ah, cool. So it's like effectively leveraging the language server to a greater extent.
Yeah, a lot more code path sharing under the hood. We use what TypeScript calls it the project service, which is the set of functions provided by TypeScript that you can pass a path to a file and it'll give you back, here's how to describe type information for the file, some APIs like that, which is really exciting because previously we were manually creating those things on our end, effectively doing what the project service does for us. And because we are not TypeScript, neither technically nor organizationally, the people behind it, we weren't doing as good of a job as what the project service is able to do now.
By the way, one more point that Jay Larkey brought up in another comment is that, quote, some things are framework specific, like rules of hooks or solid lint for um, restructuring props.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, these days, most TypeScript slash JavaScript developers work in the context of a framework and a meta framework. And there are, let's call it, additional rules that are or paradigms that are more specific for whatever framework you choose. So things that again are totally legal in the context of general purpose TypeScript or JavaScript might be things that you want to avoid in the context of framework. And indeed, the structuring is probably in issues with the structuring in solid is probably a good example where you might unintentionally lose reactivity because of the structuring that's perfectly legal in JavaScript and TypeScript.
Yeah. Shout out Jay Larkey. Great point.
Yeah. By the way, it's interesting in another context. We had the people from the Meta team a few what's it weeks, months back talking about the new React compiler, and interestingly, that compiler also has a linting aspect to it. They have like the rules of React, and they're looking at ways to enforce best practices of React using that compiler. So it'll be interesting to see how they flag things, whether it's an errors or warnings or whatnot. Like you said, even if it's warnings, there's a good chance you still want to break the build. But interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see linting making its way into so much stuff.
Yeah. I'm really excited about it. I think it's a really, really cool area that's really useful. And now that folks respect it, it's getting more and more stuff.
Hmm. And I now that that's out, I imagine that you've started working on the next version, right?
Yeah, we tend to reserve a few months, even a year or two at most, probably just up to a few months after each major version of just cleanups. We released this big new thing, this project service, which is a different way of configuring typed linting. Well, now we have all the myriad different ways people were previously setting up type linting coming in and telling us ways it does or doesn't work for them. So there's a lot of cleanup there. Also, I think there's a lot of value in a project just spending time working on things that don't have a huge determined purpose, like paper cuts, cleanups, documentation improvements, which is I think the phase we're in right now.
Hmm, cool. So you're not yet thinking so much about V9 at this point in time.
Yeah, not so much. I think long term, um, there is a new snazzy thing we want to start using more, which is there's a API that TypeScript used to not expose called the assignability API. Is type assignable too? Previously in type checking APIs, excuse me, the stuff that lint rules can use, you can get the type for something. You can say get the type of this function call, the returns type, and see if it's, let's say, a promise or something with a dot then. But you couldn't check two things and see if one is assignable to the other. Like if this number is assignable to that string or something else. But now that that API is available to us, they marked it as state. There are a lot of really interesting lint rules you can do with it. Like for
Hmm.
example, um, you could, instead of just saying no inferable types, don't add a type annotation that's triple equal to the same as whatever type something is. You could write a lint rule that bans type annotations that are wider than the thing. Like if you say const value colon string equals quotes, we can say, aha, that string is actually losing type information. TypeScript by default would be able to infer that this is some string literal or union of literals rather than just the general string. So very exciting stuff. I know.
Yeah. No, this is cool. Look, w- there is a challenge here, and it's an issue that's been brought up by people like Theo, I think, and others, also Ryan Carniato, uh, about how like that TypeScript really has two target audiences in a way. There's the distinction that they made was between uh, application developers and library developers or library makers. That application developers usually uh, are able to use it at without diving too deeply into sophisticated types, and library developers or people that create APIs are kind of forced to. I think the line is often drawn around generics, but I'm. It seems to me that generics is becoming more like public domain. Like it's no longer such black magic that as it used to be, I think. Um, but it's an interesting point, and I'd love to hear from our audience about that, what they think. So it used to be that, if you were an application developer, you could use TypeScript without having to understand how generics work. But if you were a library developer, if you created APIs, you had to understand generics. It's interesting to think whether or not a tool like TSESlint can, in a sense, make it easier for people to up their TypeScript game, like to be more like library developers and not and being able to do it without getting too much in the weeds. Like the alternative, of course, is to use some sort of chat GPT like tool to write your TypeScript for you. But I'm wondering whether something like TSESlint can also help in that context. What do you think?
Oh, I have so many thoughts here. Yes, strong agree. Um, Another big benefit of lint rules can be best practices, not just the, don't use for in on an array, but things like preferring, stylistic consistency in how you write your types. Types versus interfaces is one of the big debates in TypeScript, where, much like the functions you mentioned earlier, the answer is it doesn't matter, just be consistent. Um, we do have quite a few rules though that flag common bad practices that result from people not having that full deep understanding, and then let you know, hey, this is why it's wrong. Here are the options to fix it. I think the two really exciting big ones that I can dive into if you want are empty types and the golden rule generics or unnecessary type parameters. Those are two big ones that a lot of people trip up on that we now have lint rules to help people learn
No,
better on.
please do. Please do.
Awesome. So the empty object, or the just curly boys object type in TypeScript, that describes any object, any value other than null and undefined. So you can say let value colon curly brackets, just empty object, equals quote something, because string is a value in JavaScript and TypeScript. Therefore, it's assignable to the empty object type. Same with number. The literal 0 is allowed, which is horrifying and confusing to many people. So we have a lint rule that says, hey, don't use the empty object type, except in certain situations where it's reasonable to. Instead, what you probably want is an insert list of common alternatives, such as unknown or non-nullable.
So basically, just to clarify though, in TypeScript, when you use empty object as a type, not
Mm-hmm.
as a value, but as a type, it means anything which isn't null or undefined.
Yes. I might be missing some nuance there, but that's roughly what it comes out to in production, in practice.
Okay. To be honest, I'm struggling to remember if I've ever used this. Uh, Probably not. I prefer my
Great.
types to be a bit narrower.
Fantastic.
It's not much better than an any, let's put it this way.
Yeah, it's like it's this weird kind of halfway between any and unknown, where a lot of things are assignable to it, but you can't really do anything with it. Um, and honestly, some people just happen across the type and then use it instead of unknown. That's like a really common slip up there, where they should have just used unknown or any.
Yeah, that's what Jay Larky is saying as well.
Hi, Jay Larky. Yeah.
So you've got an TS-ESLint. It's a problem. I start saying ESLint and then I
I
remember
know.
to say TS-ESLint. Um, so you've got a TS-ESLint rule that basically what forbids it?
We used to we used to have a rule called ban types, which banned a list of problematic built-in types, such as that and uppercase n number, as opposed to lowercase n number. Same with string and boolean. We split that up into several rules. So the specific rule we're talking about now, I have to go to our website to look up the name because I can never remember. Is no empty object type. That's specifically for that one. And then we have a few other rules for other problematic built-in types, like the uppercase built-ins.
So it's kind of like JavaScript in a sense, and it's not surprising that once TypeScript adds stuff in, it's very difficult for them to take it out without, breaking existing code bases. But it's easier for you guys to add rules that forbid it.
Yeah. And arguably, in this case, they made the right choice by having it as is. One might write, let's say, a generic function that takes in a generic type, that extends any object with length number as a property. So you could pass in strings, arrays, some object that happens to have length on it. That's all fine. Intentionally, that type, that squiggly brackets length number type, allows arrays, because arrays are objects that happen to have a length property. It would be weird and confusing if removing that length property from that object now meant arrays weren't allowed in this case.
Hmm,
So there's no real right answer here. Either you have a weirdness in the type system, or you have a weirdness in the type system that also trips people up sometimes in a different way than before.
interesting. Okay, so that was one interesting example. You had the second one, was it? What was it?
I respect and appreciate that you remembered that. I'd forgotten about it. It's a new rule called no unnecessary type parameters. It's based on what's called the Golden Rule generics, which is actually comes from another TypeScript book published by O'Reilly and authored by Dan Vanderkam, who then was a co-author on the PR adding this lint rule. Shout out Dan Vanderkam. But the idea is people oftentimes write generic type parameters for functions that don't actually do anything or actively hide type errors inside. The most common one is they'll write wrappers around JSON.stringify or some kind of parsing thing where they'll add in a generic type saying, okay, the result of this function is whatever generic you pass me. Let's say generic JSON.stringify my type, return JSON.parse thingy as my type. The problem is there's nothing in the type system that actually verifies the value you returned from that function is the type you said it was. And there's nothing at runtime either. So this is unsafe. Someone could pass a totally invalid string, and your type parameter usage made it look like the return of that function adheres to that type, even though the totally invalid string gave you some other garbage. So this is what's called the golden rule of generics. Only use type parameters if they are actively useful, if they're actually used to relate to types later on, or if they're somehow used repeatedly throughout your type signature. This rule is new, and I'm still not sure I'm quite good at explaining it. Did that kind of make sense?
Yeah, but I'm still thinking about it because, well, obviously, if there's a type that you pass in that you don't actually use, like an unused parameter, that's really easy to flag. But you are talking about something else.
Yeah. Unused would be that it's declared once and never used again. Unnecessary in this context would be that it's declared once and used once, such as in the return of a function. Uh, the point of a type parameter is to relate two things, to say, based on the input, the output is different. If you're not
Yeah,
relating two things, what's the point?
if you're just let's put it this way, if the type can never be inferred, then it's kind of pointless in a sense.
Yeah,
I need to think about that though.
sure.
Like y- y- you might explicitly pass in a particular type. Let's put it this way. Whenever I'm using generics and I find myself being required to explicitly specify the type rather than having it being inferred, then it kind of feels like a code smell.
Yeah, that's a great point. Both on this context and just the general usability of you should structure your, generics such that people don't have to do weird explicit things. The I think a better example that I should have given to start would be, let's say you're writing a generic log function. Log takes a type parameter t and a single value of type t and returns void. So you could like log parentheses some string or log parentheses an array or an object or whatnot. There's no point to that t, to that type parameter. You're not returning it. You could have said unknown for your values type, and there would be no functional difference in your code or its types. So that t, function log t parentheses value t, it's not unused because the value is still type t, but it's unnecessary. It doesn't change the return type. It doesn't relate anything. Does that make sense?
Yes, here's the thing though, because in other programming languages, statically typed programming languages where the type system is part of the actual compiler, languages like C++ or Java or C sharp, then these case it is useful
Mm-hmm.
because that's for two reasons. First of all, that's how they make themselves more like JavaScript. And the second thing is that it allows them to have different implementations thanks to functional overloading. So they can have like a generic parameter, like you said, t, and the type goes in, but then they have a different implementation if t is a string or t is a number or t is an array or whatever. In JavaScript, those things are meaningless. First of all, you don't need to create dynamic on type of JavaScript because it is, and with TypeScript, you like you said, it's just any, and you got the same dynamic capabilities that you had before, and you don't really have implementation overloading. So so both of those benefits that you have in other programming languages are kind of meaningless in the context of TypeScript. But like you said, it's still legal. So yeah, it's a place where the linter can kind of step in. But yeah, I think that's a really good example.
Thanks. What we've seen when people adopt the rule in larger code bases is they'll have the occasional little thing like the parse or the log function. It'll catch, save them a few characters or some clarity here and there. But then deep in their utilities library, there will be this long trail of deleted code where there's this chain of whatever 5 things deep, where at the very bottom of the chain there's an unnecessary type parameter. And because of that unnecessary type parameter existing, they previously had all sorts of places passing type parameters through, piping it down to get there. And once we removed the unnecessary type parameter, we could delete a dozen different type parameters in their code, making it all simpler automatically or semi-automatically with the rule. And it doesn't actually harm or remove anything that was useful. So this rule, I think, is going to be more and more exciting to people as time goes on and we advertise it and learn about it more.
Yeah, I've been thinking about another way to phrase it. At the end of the day, we have to remember that in TypeScript, ultimately, all the types get stripped away. Types that you put in have zero impact on the code that gets generated. They're deleted. In this context, by the way, it could have been a pick, but it's interesting what Node is now introducing with that ability to, like, with their support for TypeScript, which literally just strips out all the types. Um, and and therefore, if if the types have zero impact on runtime, their value is that they assist you during the development time. But if they don't do that, then they're pointless.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say there is one point to them, which is that some people feel very good when they put types in that are very complicated, and that honestly is a reason for a lot of the really complex types out there. And sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's not. I think a lot of developers go through a lot of growing pains, adding types, getting excited about it, and then realizing, oh no, not all this was useful, before they find that beautiful zen of only adding them where it's actually functional.
Let's put it this way. You can have sophisticated types in your TypeScript if the end result is that the actual user of the API can avoid specifying any types.
Yeah.
That's the true beauty of sophisticated types in TypeScript.
Yeah.
If the user of your API needs to specify types, like in generic types, then my argument is that it's a code smell. You kind of failed.
Yeah. It would be cool to
Uh,
see if someone could enforce that with a lint rule. I don't know how that would work, but whenever
yeah.
there's a best practice, my instinct is to try to encodify it, even if it's not possible. There are some best practices that are not really code capable.
So unless you've got more things that you want to say about TypeScript and types and linting, I think we want to talk a little bit about SquiggleConf, don't we?
Yeah, let's do it. SquiggleConf, a conference for excellent web dev tooling. Sparkle emoji.
It's one of those times where you actually want those automatic reactions that you get on the Mac, where you do like something like that, or balloons pop up. I can never
Yeah.
get it to work when I want it to work.
Yeah, I think I disabled them at the OS level and then completely forgot about it, and I always get disappointed when they don't come up. Not
So
sure.
squiggle, I think you might have said that it's because of the squiggle lines that we get from developer tools that want to highlight certain things or draw attention to certain things, so they put a squiggly line under it. I actually think that it was we had it first in things like Word or Office before it actually made its way into developer tooling, I think.
Yes.
Like
I also think that, but I'm not sure myself.
yeah, like spelling errors and then grammar errors and stuff like that. And anyway, so that's the motive. That's where the name comes from, right? It's because the topic of the conference is developer tooling, right?
Yes. We're talking about, I mean, the catchphrase is excellent web dev tooling, but in general, yeah, it's anything that you as a person writing web code, such as but not limited to JavaScript, TypeScript, Rust, might want to learn about. So everything from TypeScript at scale, at say how Bloomberg does things, to the person who made Oh My Zeesh is talking about the journey of that open source tooling and the lessons learned. Uh,
So first of all, when and where?
October 3rd for talks, and then morning workshops October 4th. That's a Thursday, 2024. So at time of recording in a month and a half.
And it's like, is it online? Is it physical? Is
It
it
is
both?
it's physical. We'll put the talks up for free videos after the conference, but the location, the venue, is the attached theater at the Boston New England Aquarium. So we have got a bit of a fish theme. I will say there's an excellent penguin exhibit next door at the aquarium itself, and we're on the pier, like on the water. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Lunch is going to be at Fenwell Hall, the like really nice touristy marketplace right next to the venue. And because it's a Thursday during the week, it's going to be not too crowded.
And it's one day for the talks and the second day for workshops. That's the format.
Yeah. Morning workshops. We're trying to keep it a little smaller. I think our ideal would have been 2 days of talks with some workshops, but it's our first time and we wanted to make sure we could get it right before really going big.
Can people still get tickets?
They can, and I would encourage them to do so. Fun fact that a lot of conference organizers have told us, we've seen also, that most people wait until the last minute to buy tickets, which is horrible for two things. One, well, you never know, maybe they'll sell out. Two, it's very scary for us conference organizers to
Yeah, it's
see.
stressful.
Whew, yeah. So please buy tickets to SquiggleConf. We've got bulk discount options on the website. We're happy to work with you if you need help getting it. We also have volunteering options if you can't afford a ticket. So let us know.
So, how many talks are you planning to have?
Let me get that schedule up right now. Currently, our plan is 9 full-length talks and 5 lightning talks.
Oh, cool. That's really nice. Any ones that you especially want to draw attention to?
I fear I fear responding to that too assertively, as I don't want to upset any speakers. But I'll say our launch speakers, as an arbitrary delineation, are Dan Vanderkam, who I referenced earlier. He's talking about ASTs and source codes and text, like how source files actually work. Roselle Scarlett over at TBD talking about documentation as part of your tooling and processes. And Tishian Sunikova Dragomir over at Bloomberg talking about TypeScript at scale and the things they do to manage a gigantic amount of TypeScript code. Also, fun fact, they contributed some great features up to TypeScript.
Yeah, they're doing some really interesting stuff over at Bloomberg, that's for sure. So that is really cool. Um, also, Boston is obviously a beautiful city.
Yeah.
And October, that means like fall. So it's like the trees will be all red and stuff.
I hope so. To be honest, I had originally really wanted a Halloween conference, as that is my favorite holiday by far. I was told rather bluntly that parents do not want a conference instead of trick or treating. It's not something that they can support. So yeah, I think we'll have a good fall theme going on. You're right. It's a beautiful city, beautiful area. And one of the things we intentionally did was have it on a Thursday with workshops the next morning so that speakers can go with us on a duck tour after. And then we're
Hmm.
going to try to get some kind of partnership with the aquarium to help people explore that
Are
too.
you also still looking for sponsors and stuff like that?
If someone wants to sponsor us, they certainly can reach out. It's on the website. But we've got a good set of sponsors so far. I can't announce them all, but we're pretty happy with it. But yeah, no, if you want to send us money, we're happy to work with you.
That's really cool. It's really nice to see a new conference appearing. It seems like ever since COVID, conferencing has been in a bit of a rut. Like we all hoped that it would make a total comeback after COVID, but it seems to be fairly challenging. And I'm even seeing certain conferences like suspend operation.
Yeah.
Uh, and so seeing a new one come along, especially about such an important and exciting and interesting topic, seems um, like a great thing. And hopefully, I can get my own employer to sponsor, let's say next year or something, because we are also into developer stuff. Some of our stuff isn't ready yet, so we're not ready to showcase it yet. Hopefully, next year we will be. So we will see. We will see. I'd
We'll
love
see.
to talk at a conference like that. Um, Anything else before I pull us into picks?
Um, no, I appreciate actually, yeah, one thing I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to plug SquiggleConf. The reason why we chose to have it this year, post COVID, neither of us two organizers actually live in Boston. I'm moving end of August this year. Is we agree. It there's a lot of benefit from conferences. You don't have to go to a conference, to be a whatever great dev, influential, etc. But there's a lot of benefit from the hallway track, from just chatting with people,
Oh
from
yeah, for sure.
giving talks. So we're really excited to be able to provide that, to people both generally in Boston and generally in web dev tooling, which doesn't have a lot of dedicated conferences for it specifically.
Yeah, it seems like it should. I mean,
Yeah.
like developers are so into tooling. It feels like we definitely should have a conference about tooling. So it's great that finally we do.
Yay.
By the way, so this is, I think, is it your first time as a conference organizer?
Yeah, I've I've helped out with conferences before, like doing websites or helping with promotions, but nothing quite so in the weeds as being an actual organizer. And I got to say, it's a lot of work. They were right. All the people who told us it was a lot of work.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, happily, I've yet to do it. I've spoken at conferences, as have you, but organizing, I don't know. I'd rather let somebody else do it. Um, okay then. Before we go into picks, if people want to, connect with you, be it about TSCS-Lint, about linting in general, about open source, about SquiggleConf, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Love the question. For me, Joshua K. Goldberg on virtually every platform: .com, GitHub, Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon. Um, Joshua K. Goldberg. For my projects, each of them have their own website. So typescript-eslint, eslint, Mocha. Eslint, I'm but on the committer team, so please don't come at me yelling about flat config or whatever pain you're going through. That's the team at whole. But for all of the projects, we're always happy to hear your feedback and work with you.
Cool. Okay, then I'll pull us now into picks. Um, to be honest, I don't have so much in the context of picks. I actually, you know what? I actually have two things. So my first pick is, I might have mentioned this before. Um, I recently started tweeting out my favorite standalone fantasy novels. So one thing about fantasy books is that fantasy authors really love to write series of books, usually trilogies, but not necessarily. Um, and I sometimes want to just go for a single standalone book, something that, you can read on its own, finish it, and then kind of move on with your life. And that's especially the special benefit is that you don't have to worry about when the next book is ever going to come out. You know, cough, cough. Uh, George R. R. Martin and you know, Game of Thrones and Tales of Ice and Fire. Which to be honest, if he ever does come out with the next book, which is I'm highly doubtful of, I probably won't read it now. It's the time has come and gone. Um, anyway, so I tweeted out the list. I actually have a couple of more books that I have to tweet out in this context. So, let me see if I can remember some of the examples that I gave. Um, One of them would be Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere. Have you read it?
No, but I know the author name, so it's of
Yeah.
interest.
And another one is Zelazny's Lord of Light. Roger Zelazny was a very famous uh, science fiction and fantasy author, very prolific, now deceased. So he wrote some very famous series of books, but I have a very special spot for the Lord of Light book, which is a standalone book. Um, and I'll post the link to that Twitter thread that I keep adding to in the show notes. So that would be my first pick. And by the way, if people have their own favorite books that they want to suggest, you know feel free to send them to me. I love I love suggestions of good books. Um, Another one, by the way, you know what? I'll give you another one or two. There's Weave World by Clive Barker. Have you heard of Clive Barker?
Vaguely familiar name, but no.
Yeah, he actually is more famous for writing horror-related stuff, like the Pinhead character. If you is from one of his books, and so he wrote this crazy book called Weave World, which is a crazy combination of it's like part fantasy, part horror. It's very weird and it's very wonderful in my opinion. So that's another great standalone book. And another one would be Tigana by Guy Granville Kay. He's the guy that worked with Christopher Tolkien on releasing the Silmarillion. They basically went through Tolkien's notes and writings and basically managed to make a book out of it. Uh, so he wrote some books on his own, and his standalone book is called Tigana, and it's also a great book. I think I actually picked that one in the last episode that I participated on, so I'm mentioning it again. My second pick is I've been kind of down. This is not a good time for me. I mean, on a personal level, things are fine. I've got a new job that I'm happy with. Everybody in my family is healthy and whatnot, but my mother-in-law passed away, and in Israel in general it's a bad time. And yeah, so I've been kind of down, and I'm looking for things that can pick me up, and my wife and I happened on the Despicable Me slash Minion movies, and we kind of rewatched several of them, and they're so great. They're so lighthearted, funny, pleasant to watch. The Minion characters are obviously wonderful, but not just. The Group character is great as well. So yeah, if you're looking for a pick me up, I would definitely recommend these movies. And those would be my picks for today. Do you have any picks for us, Josh?
I do. Plus one to having some nice, lighthearted, high quality lightheartedness in today's world. Um, I've been wanting to become more of a reader. I used to when I was a teenager read constantly. I exhumed everything from the depths of the sci-fi fantasy section of my local library. And I haven't done that as much recently. So I'm still kind of catching up. So recently I've read kind of the classics that a lot of people may know. Neuromancer is a great sci-fi book that I
Mm,
think was rather influential in the genre. I'm not cutting new ground here. I recently read through the Foundation series also, which was very good. Really changed over the course of the series.
yeah,
I've yeah, a lot of respect for that. It's hard to
people should be aware that the book series is very different from the TV show. Both are actually pretty
yeah,
are good, but they're very different, both in terms of tone and the actual story.
yeah. Similar on that note, Witcher, loved the game. Witcher 3 was the one I played. I've been meaning to play the others, and then I'm in a book club with some friends reading the series. Not a huge fan of the show, to be honest.
Yeah,
Some good and
to
some
be
bad parts
honest
of
as
it.
well, I wanted to say it. I tried to watch a show and I couldn't get into it.
Yeah, there are a lot of great parts of it, especially Henry Cavill. Oh my gosh! But that one bathtub scene. But the his acting is phenomenal, and just I couldn't get into the rest of the show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is what it is.
it is what it is. Um, No, otherwise, my wife and I, we've been watching Monk, the old TV show, as kind of
Oh
our
yeah, it's
comfort.
on Netflix, I believe.
Yeah, yeah. We're midway through it. It's quite good. Highly recommend. It's very nice. It's kind of I think the epitome of that genre, that era of early 2000s episodic shows where people
Yeah.
they had an appetite for actual good shows, but it wasn't this really deep, intense stuff you get these days with these HBO miniseries. So really
Yeah,
enjoying it.
you could watch just a single episode and it's totally self-contained. It's not quite believable. Like, it's funny to compare to a lot of the British TV shows of the same time or the same era, where in the American shows you had like that every episode was self-contained. So if like it was a crime drama, the crime happened at the beginning, they solved it, there was a trial,
Yeah.
the criminal got convicted, done. It's like, Law and Order, I think, was the epitome of that
Yeah.
type of shows. Also also CSI. Um, Whereas the British shows, they kind of, the entire season was just the one crime, and then the mini dramas that you get on streaming today kind of emulate those British shows where it's the entire season for the one crime.
Yeah. Different. That actually, by the way, reminds me. I fell in love with the show Good Omens, the British one. I
Mm.
I had never heard of it until it randomly popped up in like Reddit or something. But it's fantastic. Highly recommend. It's this whimsical, I don't know, biblical characters in the modern day. It has Michael Sheen and David Tennant. John Hamm shows up in a later season. Really, really good stuff. Highly recommend.
Funnily, I read the book, but have not watched the TV show.
Hmm.
The book, by the way, is by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett.
Yeah, it's hilarious. It's all sorts of clever, I'd say. It's I don't know how to describe these. It's like very British humor. Like, it's these characters who driven by these odd quirks just get into these ridiculous situations. But it's also this really compelling story about, good versus evil and the nuances and the inability to define those two concepts in a dynamic, people driven world. I don't
So
know
if
how to reconcile
if
that.
if that's your jam, then I would highly recommend that you read, not watch, read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series of books.
Mm,
The movie's pretty bad. The books, on the other hand, are awesome.
okay,
So yeah, if that kind of sense of humor, Terry Pratchett was very much inspired by Douglas Adams. Let's put it this way.
great. Add into the list.
Um, yeah. So with that, I think I'll end our show. Thank you again for coming again onto our show and speaking both about TSES Lint and about SquiggleConf and putting yourself out there. And all the best with both endeavors and with the move to Boston.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on here, letting me plug things, and also, best of luck with the new job and getting them to sponsor SchoolConf 2025.
Yeah, let's hope. Let's hope. So, okay. Bye, everybody. Thank you for listening in. Bye bye. And how do I stop and stream? And the stream.